Okay, overview for today. Okay, so every time we create a function, we're creating a contract. The contract is saying whoever calls our function must put in the correct input, and if they put in the correct input, then we will give them the correct return value or output. That's why when we define functions, we always specify what the data types are for what we're returning back to the user, and we specify what the data types are for the input that we are expecting. So parts of a definition function, what is this first part? The first thing we put in the function header, what is that called?
Return type?
Yep, the return type. So in this case, what we're saying is anyone who calls our function add, we will give you back a double. So that's our end of the contract. The middle part is the function name. And then what's the other side of the contract? What do we expect from whoever calls our function? Yeah, so the input parameters. And notice that we specify, one, the variable name, so we can call these whatever variable names we want, but we also specify what the data type is of those variables. Then we do something in the function, and then we return sum. And in this case, notice that sum is of type double, which is expected because we said we were going to return back a double. Any questions here? Okay. Last class we did, you all created a function called isVotingAge. So in this problem, we ask the user for their age, and then we return true or false based on whether they're old enough to vote or not. So what would be the return type for this problem? Okay, a bool, because we're going to be returning true or false. Cool. So it's bool, and then what is the data type of our input parameter? Data type, or sorry, repeat that one more time.
You said data type?
Yeah, of the input parameter.
Int?
Yeah, so in this case, we're asking the user for their age, so we'll do that as an int. So we accept the age from the user, we do some calculations, some if statement comparisons, and then we return back a bool. Any questions here? Okay. So now how would someone actually call isVotingAge function? I want to specify one thing. I realized a lot of times I was saying the user might be calling the function. It's technically not the user that calls the function. It's like we as programmers will call the function. So functions are just something that are used for programmers to help us organize our code, to help us reuse our code. So when I talk about like whoever calls our function, that can be us or it can be some other programmer if it's like a public library. So we saw the example of what was like a standard library. We saw square root. So some programmer created this function square root, and now we as programmers can call that function square root. So, and likewise, if we're working on a group project, one person in the class could create a function called isVotingAge, and then someone else in the class can call that function isVotingAge. So it's not really users that are using functions, it's the us as programmers that are using it. Okay, so a programmer creates the function int main, they have this bool variable can vote, and they want to set can vote equal to a value. Let's say we wanted to check if a 22-year-old could vote. What could we put on the right side of the equal sign? Yeah, so we're going to call isVotingAge. So when the computer sees this, it's going to jump up to this line, isVotingAge, and then it's a one-to-one mapping. So you'll see the first input expected is int age, and the first value that we put in here is 22. So what is the value of age going to be in our function? Age is going to be 22. So that's the third way that we can assign a variable in CS. The first way was just using the equal sign, like we did here, the assignment operator. The second way is using cout and cin. And then this new third way is to pass a value into a function. And whatever variable we put in the input parameter gets mapped to that value. Any questions there? Okay. So just looking at how the code looked, again, this bool isVotingAge is exactly like the slide. And then in main, we have bool can vote, x equals 21, and then we call can vote isVotingAge of x. Why is it okay that we're passing in x here and it's not the same name as age? Why is it that we call this variable age, but we pass in the value x? Shouldn't that have errored? Why did this code still end up working?
Line 16, x equals 21, so we put in x and voting age is going to be the same as 21.
Yeah, so the variable gets evaluated first. So the computer sees x, and the computer doesn't care how we name variables. The computer cares how we name functions. Like is voting age and is voting age has to be the same, but the computer doesn't care how we name variables. Variables are just used to help us programmers. So the computer sees this value x, sees that it's the value 21, and then when it calls is voting age, just says, okay, int age should be 21. It's not saying int age equals x, it's saying int age equals the value of x, which is 21. Does that distinction make sense? A lot of students, I think, will have trouble with this concept here of these two variable names not matching up. The only thing that has to match is the data type. They both have to be ints. Yep. Okay, no questions there? Makes sense? Yeah.
So you always, if you're doing bool in your code, you always have to have it outside of your int main function.
So this bool, so is voting age, we define this function is voting age. And there's three things we need when we define a function. The first is the return type. So it's saying this function is going to return a bool. And we can see in our code at line 6 or line 8, we return true or false. So that's why we put bool here. If we were returning a string, then this would have said string instead of bool. So this first part is just the data type. The second thing we need is the function name. And then the third part is the input parameters and what data types we expect. So yeah, so everything in this function header is just the data type for what we expect and what we're going to give back. So people have been asking about why do we always put int main? So main is a function. You can tell that because we have the return data type, we have the function name, which is main, and then we have the parentheses. But in this case, there's no input into main. So why is it always int? And why do we never return anything in the main function? Yeah. Okay.
When the function ends, it returns 0 automatically.
Yeah, so main is the only special function that will automatically return a value. Every other function, if we say we're going to return an int, we have to actually return an int. But in the main function, it's just going to assume that if we don't have a return value, it's going to be 0. Which is why sometimes when you read textbook code, it will say like return 0. Like you can put that in if you want. But the computer automatically does that, which is why when I've coded, I haven't done it. When the computer errors, and it says like your error message, the code is actually returning 1 and stopping the rest of the code from running. So essentially the computer knows if there are no errors, then the return value is just 0. Otherwise, if there is an error, then the code returned a value of 1. All right, that was more of a side tangent. You don't have to fully memorize all that, but the main takeaway there is int main is a function. Okay. Any questions on the recap before we get into new material? Everyone good? Okay. Yeah.
My connection isn't working. I'm not keeping my computer to log on to this.
Connect to Wi-Fi.
Yes.
I seem to also be having troubles with connecting to Wi-Fi.
It's like so slow. It's not even
Everyone? Okay. Okay. Yeah. There's not really too much I can do about that right now. I'll try to talk to IT staff later, and we'll see if we can get it resolved, because I've been having issues recently as well. I guess for now, if you have like a Word doc or something offline that you can take notes with, or paper or pen, that might be best. Okay, so 0 input parameters. So far, all the functions we've talked about have taken in some sort of input parameter. So for is voting age, we asked for the user's age. For add, we asked for num1 and num2. But you don't always have to take an input when you create a function. And an example of a function that already exists that doesn't take an input is the rand function. So rand, can anyone guess what it does? Yeah, Christian? Yeah, it gives a random number. So we don't actually need an input from the user, because the function is just going to give some random number back. Like what would we even take as input? you could, okay, maybe if you were to define it, you could say like, give me a number between 0 and this. So you could do like your start and end. But this one without any parameters is just going to give you any random number. Yeah, question.
What's CSTD?
Yeah, so in order to use the rand function, we have to include this C standard library. So for different built-in functions, we have to include different files. If I ever have you use a function, like in the labs, I always tell you what include statement to put at the top. So a lot of the math functions are included in C math. This one is in C standard library. Okay. So it doesn't require input parameters, but why did we still put these parentheses after, even though there were no input parameters for this function? Think about what the code would look like if we removed the parentheses.
What do you think it's a data type?
Not a data type, but it will think it's something else, so you're on the right track.
I don't think it's a variable.
Yeah, it's gonna think it's a variable, because, right, think about it, if we remove these parentheses, that's the same thing as saying like int x equals y, or like int x equals rand, random number equals rand. Like it'll treat it as an assignment statement, and without the parentheses, it'll look for this variable rand. And it'll look above in the main function, and it'll see that there's no variable called rand, and it'll throw an error. So anytime we call a function, we always put the parentheses, even if there's no input parameters. And then especially if there are input parameters, then obviously you need the parentheses. That way you can specify what your inputs are. Does that make sense? Okay. I think as opposed to trying to memorize, like in this class, I don't want you to just memorize syntax for the sake of memorizing it, because you'll easily forget that. But if you can kind of remember the reasons why, that'll be easier when you start coding, right? If you forget these parentheses when you start coding, and it says like rand not defined in scope, hopefully you'll remember this lecture and be like, oh, it thinks rand is a variable, and it can't find it in the scope. So I need to add the parentheses to make it a function call. Okay, so creating a function. So I'm going to have you all in groups create this function. It's going to be called getPositiveNumber. Essentially, we're going to ask the user for a positive number, and we're going to keep asking them until they enter a positive number. So first off, what statement type are we going to use inside of our function if we're going to have the user keep doing something? A while loop, and is this going to be a counting problem or a validation problem? Validation, because we don't know how many times the user is going to put in a negative number, so we want to keep asking them to input it. And then after you get the value, make sure you return the value at the end of the function. Here. Standard one. Alright, John, Cleet, and Justin, I'll have you three go together here. Carlos, you join these two here. All right, actually write it out so that I can see what people are writing and see where we need more practice. Yeah. So I just heard you done an upgrade one today. This is for your work, like 5
Oh, no, we don't need it. No, it's fine, we don't need this code.
So you just had to submit the code that we have it in, and now you can either submit it today or something this week. I would encourage you to do it today so it's not during your.
So when you make functions,
And you have all the code ready online right now, and you don't have to worry about it over the weekend. Yeah, so before you meet with them, just like fill these out, so that when you meet with them,
Just trying to get it done.
show me that your code works.
So
You'll have
that
like
check would be like.
just to show that all. But for now, let's work on this function. All right, let's focus up. Think about what your return type is going to be for this function.
So basically, return type will be positive.
And then you're gonna name it the positive number. And then in parentheses, double, and then variable has to be greater than.
Just get you guys your own separate now that Mark came.
Well, in the parameters, you just want to receive a double. Doesn't really matter what this is called.
So what is the general?
Give positive number is gonna be what.
So in, can't receive decimal. Double it.
We'll let the users do whole numbers or decimal numbers. Make sure it works for
And then it's
your case.
function name, but it has to be greater.
Yeah, while loop, so, this is while.
So,
Why is it messed
the function is called multiple, so double
And right now, we're not checking if it's positive zero, we're checking if it's greater than because,
Think about if we actually need any
You're right.
input parameters for
They
this
want a
problem.
positive number, so.
Yes,
We're going to be asking the
Yeah.
user for a number inside of our
less than zero.
function with COUTs and CINs. So think about if we need to actually, we might not need any input in the return.
Or you say we can just do parentheses and then a C instead used for a variable.
Less than equal to 0.
So there's no parameters, C and bottom.
Yeah, so just looking at people's things, for this problem, we're not going to have any input parameters. Your parentheses are going to be empty. We're trying to ask the user with COUTs and CINs inside of our functions for the positive numbers.
So this is the fact where it's like a positive number,
Stated.
positive, or if it is positive, then you can just turn.
So,
Or not something, it would be it would be a
positive number less than zero.
before the while, above the while.
Yeah, we put it decimal.
And then under it will be C,
Data type for so.
but while, and then it'll be the while, no. So that would be C, no, here, the while. Or like you erase the while before it.
Yeah. No, if it was greater than, then it would just skip this and go on.
So in the while loop, we keep asking for the bottom number. Eventually we'll get it. And once we get that, we want to return that.
Will we return in the one, but
No, so return number,
It'd be better to
return
have
is
because we know what the
to
while loop is.
function, so, this is saying the same, like, you know, that's how that
so
goes.
let's say return double, return
And that variable needs to be fixed.
This is just a function, so right now, instead of user puts in, you know, you have to,
What,
instead of put in, so, this is the same exact thing, whether or not it's, so, 22 is a negative number, obviously, so it's gonna make them put in a different input.
Okay.
And then after you return outside of that.
Cool.
And then the
Let's.
story in this number calculation, still just, let's say they put in, now, they put in, take out 22, so now f of x equals 22.
Okay, I'll give people 30 more seconds, and we'll bring it back.
Because x is positive. So this value right here, which is b22. Yeah, to, until they, until it receives a positive.
Okay, cool. Let's bring it back. Okay, so I think looking at people's code, most people got we want the return type to be a double. We call the function name get positive number. In this case, the point of the function is to ask the user for the number and get it. So we don't have to put any input in these parentheses. Okay, so what is the first thing we want to do in this function?
Add double number in parentheses.
Sorry, one more time.
Put double number in parentheses.
Yeah, so in the curly braces here. Okay, so I saw a lot of people when they started coding, they said something like while. A lot of code had something like this, like while, and then they said positive number is less than 0, which is a good condition. That is like the condition we want. But what is positive number? Like, do we have a variable right now called?
No, you got variable.
Yeah, so inside of this function, we have to create a variable. And so here we can create something like num, so what data type is it going to be?
Double.
Yep, double positive number. And then we'll set it to something to start. We'll set it, so we want the while loop to keep running. So, and I guess this should be less than or equal to 0. So we can set it to 0 to start so that the first time this runs, like 0 is less than or equal to 0, and then we'll actually ask the user for a number. Yeah.
What's the difference between putting it as a variable and then putting it in the parameters?
So if we put it in the parameters, then it's based on whoever calls our function. Whoever calls our function might call get positive number with -5. But then that's not really getting it. That's almost asking, like, is -5 less than 0?
Okay.
That function would maybe be like check if number is positive or negative. This one, we're literally just getting a function that says, like, get a positive number from the user. So yeah. Okay. So while positive number is less than 0, less than or equal to 0, what do we want to do?
Tell them to try again.
Yeah, so see out, we need a positive number. Okay. And then what do we do after that?
See it.
Mhm.
Positive.
Cool. Okay. And then at what point do we want to return something back to the user? I heard some groups saying, like, we could put a return value in here. So like return positive number. What happens if we do that?
You gotta put it outside the loop.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm hearing we have to put it outside the loop. What happens if we put it inside the loop?
It would run once, return the value, and then it would end.
Yeah.
The
So,
whole function would end.
so let's say we had, like, we need a positive number, C in. Let's say the user put in -5. We would then just return -5.
Yeah.
And once you have a return statement, the function ends. So we wouldn't run this loop again.
And also, it would just, the whole function would error because you're not returning anything if the number was already positive to begin with.
Yes, like we wouldn't even enter. Well, we're always going to start it off at 0. So this while loop will always run at least once.
No, what I mean is the function overall would error because there's no return value outside of the while loop. So like if it was 1,
Yeah.
then, yeah.
Yeah. So the computer needs to know that there will for sure be some sort of return value. So as people said, we want to return it outside the while loop. What do we know outside of the while loop about positive number? Yeah, that it is going to be positive. Because if it wasn't, we would have kept running this loop. Yep. All right. So I think maybe there's a little bit confusion, though, on where we would actually use this. So let's go into the EdStem. Let's see if my Wi-Fi is back.
Wait, you connect your laptop with MHC.
Yeah.
It doesn't let us do
Are you on MHC guest?
that. Devices.
Wait, it doesn't.
MHC, it acts like you have to like put in like an actual like internet network and all that other stuff. Like
Yeah,
keying
but-
in the back of the router.
I think you just put in your Morehouse ID.
Yeah, I just put in like my Morehouse ID and password, and it worked. Yeah. Okay. So in here, we have this function get positive number, and so now the nice thing is in our main function, anytime we want to get a positive number from the user, instead of having to like copy these 4 lines of code everywhere, all we can say is like int pos number equals get positive number. What do we put in the parentheses here,
You don't,
if anything?
you don't input anything.
Yeah. So the function doesn't require any input, so we just put the parentheses so that the computer knows it's a function, but there's no input, and then we can see out positive number, or we can do like certain calculations like with this. So we can do like see out square root pos number, because you can only do square root on positive numbers, right? So maybe this is a better example. Someone last class was asking like, why don't we just see out what the positive number is? Why do we always return it? The benefit of returning it is whoever calls your function can then do whatever they want with that value. If whoever calls your function wants to see out it, they can. But if whoever calls your function wants to square root it, then they also have that option. So we're just giving more options to whoever calls our function if we return the value as opposed to printing it out. Okay, so let's run this code, include cmath for the square root function. Okay. Okay, so what line number ran first?
Line 17.
Yeah, so we start with the main function. We have 17 int pos number equals get positive number. So what's the computer going to do when it sees this? It's going to go up to line 6. It's going to set positive number to 0. That's less than or equal to 0. And it says we need a positive number. So that's why line 9 just ran here. Let's say we put in something like -5. What's going to happen next? Yeah, so we're going to get to the end of the while loop. It's going to check is -5 less than or equal to 0. It is, and it's going to say, again, we need a positive number. All right, let's say I put in 9. What's going to happen next? Yeah, so we'll check 9 is not less than or equal to 0, so we'll return positive number. So we come back to line 17. What is the value of pos number? It's going to be 9. And then we see out square root of pos number. So what's happening here? Yeah, so we call a function called square root. This is a standard library function, so it exists in the CMath file. What number are we passing into the square root function? 9. So what are we going to see out? Oh, the suspense. 3. Okay, there we go.
Square root of it, not squaring it.
Yeah,
That's
no,
not wrong.
there's another function called POW, P-O-W, that can raise something to a power. But square root will, yeah.
Why are we square rooting it out?
It was just so that I can show you how you can call another function with the value from the previous function. But think about, so if we were to write code for this in pseudocode, and we were like, get the square root of a positive number, you know, maybe that would be like a lot of lines of code. But the way we describe that is get a positive number, square root positive number. And that's all we wrote in our main function. Just 2 lines of code in our main function, and it does what we want. That's the power of functions. Like anyone looking at this code should within like 10 seconds be able to tell what it does. They'll see like get positive number, square root positive number. Whereas if we had this code here, it would take a little bit more time to figure out what the code is doing. Yep. Yeah, question.
So at the top, you have those two. I was wanting to ask you what those meant for a second. The CST lib and so CMath is used whenever you're using square root.
Yeah, cstdlib we actually didn't need for this code. That was for the rand function. Yeah. Again, you don't have to memorize the include statements. If in lab or homework I ever have you use a built-in function, I'll tell you what include statement to put. All right. Does that example make sense? That actually kind of puts together almost everything we've learned about functions. Like we learned how to define our own function. We learned how to call that function. We learned how to call an existing function. The existing function required an input. The function we created did not. Right? So we've kind of, everything we've done over the last 3 lectures exists in this problem. All right. Okay, so let's talk about void return values. Does anyone know what void means just in English?
Nothing.
To cancel, it can mean nothing. To go into the void, he disappeared into the void, an empty space. They all kind of point to what void means in computer science. Does anyone want to take a guess at what void means in computer science?
Null space.
Yeah, null space. It's also, in this context of functions, it's this last line that's important. It indicates that the function does not return a value. So kind of fitting that general definition of void as something being empty, not returning anything. That's what void is in the computer science sense. So it means the function does not return a value. So in our function header, what was the first thing we needed? The return type. And we said the return types are stuff like int, double, string, bool. You can also have your return type be void. And if you put in void, what that means is that there is no return type. Your function is not going to return something. So instead of putting int or double or string here, if we just want the function to do something but not return anything, we just put void. Okay? Everything else stays the same. Any questions there? Yeah. Yeah, so that's what I have on the next slide. I'm going to have you all create a function. Typically, void functions are used if we're just printing something and we don't want to actually give back to the user. It's just like, yeah, some sort of information page, or I'll show an example on the next slide. Yeah. So,
Can you go back to the information for computer science?
yeah. It's really this last line that you need for right now. Indicates that the function does not return a value. Okay, so in your same groups, you already have your paper. We're going to create a function called print endgame message. So we're not giving back like a bool or a string to the user. We're just going to take some inputs and then figure out how we should end the game and just print out the endgame message. So we're using the same example that we used in Wordle, kind of that code that you wrote at the very end of your Wordle code. So this function is going to take 3 inputs, the guess, the answer, and num guesses, and it should print out one of these 2 things. Yep, so in your groups, we'll get started. In your function header, again, your return type is going to be void. Think about what data types you're going to use for your input types.
Oh, yeah. Well, right now we're just creating the function. We don't need to create everything surrounding it. So, with the function, we don't need it to return anything.
This is just bool, right?
Yeah, just the
No,
end of that.
this is a void function.
But we're gonna write
So
that
it's
in.
basically,
Just say void, and then you'll say double.
yeah. So this is a void function with the name is print.
Also, void is the data type.
Yeah, void is the data type. It's just gonna return nothing. Print endgame message. And then the parameters that it wants are the guess. The guess is just a string. An answer, which is also a string.
Oh,
And num guesses, which is an int.
we will do the little,
In our case, it's fine. It doesn't matter.
yeah, I didn't.
Okay. So in the function, pretty much is checking the win condition, and then we're turning out something based on that. So the player wins if the guess is equal to the answer. So this is an if statement. If guess.
No,
It's a validation too, so it's gonna be, you have the two there. It's gonna be if guess equals answer and if no.
No, this is just the in-game message. We don't need to care about anything related to anything outside of the game. This is only when the game has ended. We're checking if the player won or if the player
Oh,
lost.
yes, that, okay.
Yeah, that's all we're checking. So the win condition, if the player won, the player wins if the guess equals the answer. So if guess equals answer, then we print out congrats. You won.
And no guess.
Okay, I think people are on the right track, so we'll just go over the answer here. Okay, so to define a function here, what's going to be the return type? Void, because we're not actually giving anything back to whoever called it. We're just going to print directly in the function. So void, it was called print endgame message. So anyone who sees this function name should know what it does without necessarily knowing what it does. So just like you see like print endgame message, you know if you call this function, it should like take care of the endgame, just printing what the message is. Okay, so we have 3 inputs. What's the first one?
Yes, string.
Yep, so string guess. All right.
Answer, string, answer.
Yep, and then
And guess.
sweet. Okay, cool. And so we want our code to do different things based on these inputs. So what's the keyword we use for the statement? If. And how can we tell if the user won?
Guess equals answer.
Yep, if guess equals answer, then we see out,
Congrats, you win.
yep, you won in none guesses.
Else.
Oops.
So the first one, you just say else, and then if you do it another one, you say else in. And then if you do it again, you just say else in, and it just repeats over.
So it's if the user, if the response is based on the input, then you put else if. But if it's like the case that happens when everything else is false, then you just put else.
Yeah, so like if, else if, as many else ifs as you want, and then else at the end.
Yeah, pretty much else if is just another if statement added on top.
All right, what do we want to do in this case?
You lost.
Sorry, you lost, and the answer was, all right, cool. So now in our main function, we have like all our Wordle code. We have our nested while loops, right? After the nested while loops, we know the game is over. So instead of putting like the big if else block there, just at the very end of our code, all you would have to do now is say print endgame message. And then what would we pass in as the inputs? Okay, do we have to do double guess?
No.
Okay. Again, when you're calling it, you just need to pass in the value. So yeah, we'd have guess, answer, none guesses. In this case, our variables in the main code match these variables, but they don't have to. They just happen to in this case. Cool. All right. Any questions there? So at this point, it might still be, you might be wondering, like, what's the point of doing this? Like, we could have just put this code at the end like you did for Wordle, and it would still work fine, right? As we build bigger projects, it really helps to have each of these components in their own subsection. And so for next week's lab, we're gonna be building out an entire game where we'll build each small function, test it to make sure it works, and then put it all together. Right now, the problem with Wordle is the code wouldn't work and you had to look through 50 lines of code to figure out why it wasn't working. It was tough to isolate where the problem was. But if you do it like this with different functions, it'll become easier to fix errors, and it'll help you build your code up one level at a time. Okay, cool. Any questions on this example? Yep. Oh yeah, also let me take a screenshot of this. Okay. Cool. Okay. Midpoint survey, 5 minutes. Yeah, I think that should be enough time. So if you can open up your lab 7. We'll also be working on this in lab, but you can at least start working on this midpoint survey now. This is what Google uses to make sure that this program is worthwhile, especially now that we're entering a recession and there's budget cuts. We especially have to prove to Google that this program is worthwhile so that we can send a GIR next year. But then the second part is for me to also see class progress. So it's going to be similar questions to what you answered at the beginning of the semester, like what concepts do you feel familiar with? Hopefully now you'll be able to answer yes for a few more of those. But be honest in your answers so that I know how to teach for the rest of this semester. Yeah, so go ahead and do that. And again, I'll be taking attendance in lab for this week, so make sure you come in today, Friday at 4, or Monday at 5. I know it's homecoming week next week. That can't be an excuse for missing this Monday lab. Like if you think you're going to be busy with homecoming stuff next week, come into the lab today at 4 p.m. This is the most important lab of the semester. Okay, and then what's due? Homework 6 due on Monday. That's going to be on nested loops. Lab 7, that's the lab for this week. And then book your 20-minute Wordle presentation. Again, I would recommend you just book it today, get it over with so you don't have to think about it over the weekend and into next week. But if you want, you can also book an appointment next week.
When you say presentation, is that just with the Google TA?
That's just your 20-minute appointment. Yeah. But like, so in the presentation, they're going to ask you like, show me that your code works. And you'll have already written your test cases. So you'll say like, all right, these are my test cases to check if the user's won. And you'll like type it out as you run your code, right? Then you'll like run your code again and you'll say, okay, this is how I can tell if the user lost. And you'll do that test case. And you're like, this is how I can tell the letter's green. This is how I can tell it's yellow. This is how I can tell it's red. So we just want you to like be doing the driving. We don't want you to be like, okay, what should I do next? Like you should be kind of in charge of it. Okay, cool. So if you already finished the midpoint survey already in lab, you're good to go. Otherwise, I'd encourage you to just quickly finish it now. It'll take about 5 minutes. We still have some time. Yeah, and then lab today, 4 p.m.
On the lab, this question, bring those examples around. It should be.
Oh, example. Oh, yeah. Thank you. Oh. I wonder if it'll mess up.
If you edit it.
Like, well, I think if people already submitted, it should be fine.
I don't think, I'm pretty sure I'm the only one.
Wait, what is this one for?
This is the capitalization on lab 7. Yeah.
Okay, let's test it. Let's see. Wait, what? Why did I just?
Oh, that's the bonus words.
Interesting. Okay, yeah, I don't know why I said. Okay, enter a letter. Okay, because my tests are actually and
Yeah, the test cases are right.
the test is correct, right? Okay, so it was just a description.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, good. Okay, that's not a problem then. Cool. I thought maybe my test cases were off too. Okay, that matches now, right? Enter a letter. Okay, cool. Thanks for catching that. Appreciate it.